Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The radio static warning. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a barren wasteland shimmering under the blazing afternoon sun. The RV cruised along the empty highway, its air conditioning working overtime to battle the oppressive heat. Inside, the mood was light. Laughter and banter filled the space as the group of 5 friends enjoyed their road trip. There was Alex, the self-appointed leader of the group, always brimming with confidence. Beside him in the passenger seat was Emma, a skeptic who preferred logic over intuition. In the back sat Tom, who was documenting the trip with his camcorder, and Jenna, who had a knack for sensing things others couldn't. Finally, there was Liam, the tech enthusiast who was endlessly tinkering with his gadgets. As the RV hummed along the desolate road, Alex fiddled with the radio. The music stations had grown sparse, replaced by static and faint signals that faded in and out. "This is what happens when you're in the middle of nowhere," he muttered, turning the knob. "Wait," Jenna said, leaning forward. "Go back. Did you hear that?" Alex stopped, turning the dial back slowly. The static returned, but beneath it, there was something, a faint, rhythmic pulse. "Sounds like Morse code," Liam said, narrowing his eyes. He grabbed his phone, opening an app to decipher it. The message was simple: "Stay off the road after dark." "That's creepy," Emma said, crossing her arms. "Probably just some prank. Or a warning," Jenna said softly, her unease growing. They dismissed it and continued their journey, the incident fading into the background of their cheerful chatter. But as the day wore on and the sun dipped lower, the air in the RV grew heavier. The laughter dwindled, replaced by an uneasy silence. By the time twilight arrived, the landscape was bathed in hues of deep orange and purple. They had planned to reach the next town before nightfall, but it was clear they weren't going to make it. "Let's just pull over and camp for the night," Alex suggested. "We can't keep driving in the dark." Reluctantly, the group agreed. They found a flat, open area a short distance from the highway. The RV came to a halt, and they stepped out to stretch their legs. The desert was eerily quiet. The only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the faint whisper of the wind. "I'll set up the grill," Tom said, grabbing supplies. Emma and Liam helped him, while Jenna wandered a few steps away, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Something feels off," she murmured. "You're always saying that," Emma replied with a laugh. "Relax, it's just us and a whole lot of nothing." But as darkness fell, the nothing began to feel alive. It started subtly. The radio in the RV, which had been switched off, crackled to life. Static filled the air, followed by faint whispers that sent chills down their spines. They rushed inside to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. "That's not normal," Liam said, his voice shaking. "Must be a short circuit," Alex offered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Then, A distorted voice broke through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped. They're coming." The group froze. The voice repeated the warning before fading back into static. Emma slammed the radio off, and this time it obeyed. "What the hell was that?" Tom asked, his face pale. "A prank," Alex said, though his hands trembled as he spoke. "Someone messing with the signal." Jenna shook her head. "No, this isn't a prank. We need to leave. Now." They piled into the RV, nerves fraying. Alex turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. "Liam, check the engine," Alex ordered. Liam grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. He returned moments later, his face grim. "It's fine. There's no reason it shouldn't start." As they sat in tense silence, a sound reached their ears, a faint, rhythmic thumping. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. "What is that?" Emma whispered. They peered out the windows, but the desert was pitch black. Suddenly, the RV rocked, as though something massive had slammed into it. Screams erupted as they scrambled to hold onto something. The thumping turned into a series of rapid knocks, coming from all sides. "Who's out there?" Alex shouted, but the knocking only grew more frantic. Jenna grabbed a flashlight and aimed it through the window. For a moment, the beam illuminated nothing but empty desert. Then, a shadow flickered at the edge of the light, too fast to identify. She yelped and dropped the flashlight. "We're surrounded," she said, her voice trembling. The RV shook again, and the radio crackled back to life. The voice returned, more urgent this time. "They're here. Don't let them in." "Oh!" Emma screamed, her panic mounting. As if in response, the windows fogged up, handprints appearing on the glass. One by one, they trailed across the surface, pressing harder until the glass creaked under the strain. "Everyone, get away from the windows," Alex shouted. Minutes felt like hours as the pounding and shaking continued. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. The friends exchanged wary glances, unsure if it was safe to move. "Is it over?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the RV's headlights flickered on, illuminating a figure standing just beyond the windshield. It was tall and impossibly thin, its features obscured by the darkness. As they watched in horror, it raised a long, spindly arm and pointed directly at them. Alex fumbled with the keys again, and this time, the engine roared to life. "Hold on," he shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The RV lurched forward, barreling down the highway. In the rearview mirror, Jenna saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, keeping pace with the RV despite its speed. "Faster," she screamed. The figures gave chase for miles before finally vanishing as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. Exhausted and shaken, the group reached a small gas station. The attendant looked at them with a mix of curiosity and pity. "You're lucky you made it through the night," he said, shaking his head. People who stop in that stretch of desert, they don't usually come back. The friends didn't respond. They refueled in silence and drove on, leaving the haunted stretch of desert behind. But the radio never worked again, and the shadows of that night lingered in their minds, a reminder of the warning they should have heeded. Story 2. The Rest Stop Stranger. The highway stretched endlessly under the moonlit sky, its desolation broken only by the occasional reflective marker glinting in the headlights. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the barren landscape. Beside him, Sarah shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her phone. No signal, she muttered. How much longer until we reach the next town? Jake sighed. At least another hour. Maybe more. Want to pull over and take a break? Sarah hesitated. The thought of stopping in the middle of nowhere made her uneasy, but the monotony of the drive was wearing on her. Yeah, I guess, but only if we find a proper rest stop. Minutes later, as if summoned by her words, a rest stop appeared on the horizon. It was a small, unlit area with a single restroom building and a few parking spaces. One other RV was parked near the edge, its shadow long and distorted under the dim moonlight. Perfect, Jake said, pulling into a spot a few spaces away from the other vehicle. He killed the engine, plunging them into an eerie silence. The couple stepped out, stretching their stiff limbs. The air was cool and carried a faint metallic tang. Sarah glanced at the other RV. Its windows were dark, and the vehicle's sides were smeared with handprints, as if someone had pressed against it in desperation. That's weird, Sarah said, pointing. Jake followed her gaze, frowning. Probably kids messing around. Let's check it out. Jake, no. Sarah's voice was firm. We're not going near that thing. Jake chuckled, brushing off her concern. Relax. I'll just take a quick look. Stay here. Before Sarah could protest, he was already walking toward the RV. She crossed her arms, anxiety bubbling in her chest. The rest stop silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of Jake's footsteps on the cracked pavement. Jake peered through one of the windows. The interior was dark, but the faint glow of moonlight revealed disarray. Clothes and papers strewn about, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. He tried the door. It creaked open, revealing a musty smell that made him wrinkle his nose. Hello, he called out, stepping inside. The RV was empty. His eyes landed on a piece of paper taped to the fridge. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. Whatever you do, don't open your door tonight. Jake's stomach tightened. He grabbed the note and hurried back outside, locking the RV behind him. What is it? Sarah asked as he approached, noticing his pale face. He handed her the note without a word. She read it, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. Let's go, she said immediately. We can't stay here. The engine's overheated, Jake said, glancing at their RV. We need to let it cool down for a bit. Sarah's heart sank. She wanted to argue, but knew he was right. They climbed back into their vehicle, locking the doors behind them. The hours dragged on. the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the RV settling. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the smeared handprints or the cryptic warning. Jake tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't hide his unease. "It's probably just a prank," he said. "Some weirdo trying to scare people." "Then where are they?" Sarah shot back. "Who just leaves their RV like that?" Jake didn't have an answer. As midnight approached, a low thump echoed through the RV. Sarah froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake nodded, straining to listen. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of scratching. It was coming from the door. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. No response. The scratching grew more insistent, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Sarah's breath hitched as she clutched Jake's arm. "Don't open it," she pleaded. "I'm not going to," he assured her, though his gaze was fixed on the door. The noises continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, their fear palpable. "Do you think they're gone?" Sarah whispered. Before Jake could answer, the RV's lights flickered. A chilling sensation washed over them as the radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, followed by a distorted voice. "Let us in," Sarah screamed, and Jake lunged for the radio, yanking its power cord. The voice stopped, but the silence was now laced with an unshakable sense of dread. Suddenly, the RV rocked violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. The couple clung to each other, their panic escalating. The rocking stopped, but the windows fogged up, handprints appearing one by one. Jake grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands shaking. "If they get in, they won't," Sarah said, her voice firm despite her terror. "They can't." The rest of the night passed in tense, sleepless vigilance. The couple sat huddled together, jumping at every creak and groan of the RV. When the first rays of dawn finally broke over the horizon, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. Jake peeked out the window. The other RV was gone. "Do you think they left?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. "Maybe," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. They started their engine, relieved when it roared to life. As they pulled out of the rest stop, Sarah glanced back. The parking lot was empty except for one thing: the piece of paper Jake had taken from the other RV. It was pinned to the restroom door, fluttering in the breeze. "Whatever you do, don't open your door tonight." Jake floored the gas pedal, and they sped away, leaving the cursed rest stop behind. Neither of them spoke for miles. The only sound the hum of the engine and the faint echo of that distorted voice replaying in their minds. Somewhere, far behind them, the rest stop waited for its next visitors. Story 3. The Ghost of Lost Campers. The forest was a tapestry of ancient trees and dense undergrowth, its beauty marred by an unsettling silence. Mark and Emily had chosen this secluded spot for their family's camping trip, hoping to escape the distractions of modern life. Their two kids, Liam and Sophie, We're thrilled to spend the weekend exploring the great outdoors. This is perfect, Emily said, breathing in the crisp air as she stepped out of their RV. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. No cell service, Mark added with a grin, holding up his dead phone. Just us and nature. As the family began setting up their campsite, Liam wandered a little further into the woods. "Dad, Mom, come look," he shouted. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance before heading toward Liam's voice, Sophie skipping along behind them. What they found made them stop in their tracks. An old, abandoned RV nestled among the trees. Its exterior was rusted, the windows smudged with grime and streaks of green moss creeping up the sides. "That's odd," Mark muttered. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in years. Can we look inside?" Liam asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Emily hesitated. "I'm not sure if that's a good idea." "Oh, come on," Mark said, already climbing the short, rusted steps to the RV's door. "It's abandoned. What's the harm?" The door creaked open, revealing a musty interior. Dust motes danced in the faint beams of light that penetrated the dirty windows. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. Inside, the RV was a snapshot of another time. Plates were still on the tiny kitchenette table. A child's stuffed bear lay on one of the bunks, and family photos were pinned to a corkboard above the sink. Emily picked up one of the photos. It showed a family of 4, a man, woman, and 2 children, smiling in front of the very same RV. Her stomach tightened. "What happened to them?" Sophie asked, clutching her mother's hand. Mark found a weathered journal on the counter. The last entry was dated nearly 15 years ago. He read aloud. "Something isn't right here. We hear voices at night. The kids are scared, and so are we. We're leaving tomorrow morning. If we make it through the night." A chill ran through the RV. "Let's get out of here," Emily said sharply. Now, back at their own RV, the family tried to shake off the eerie discovery. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told stories to lighten the mood. But as night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The once inviting darkness now felt oppressive. "Do you hear that?" Sophie whispered, breaking the uneasy silence. Mark listened. Faint, almost imperceptible, came the sound of children laughing. It echoed through the trees, distant but distinct. "It's probably just the wind," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. The laughter grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to circle the campsite. Emily's eyes darted toward the forest. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," she said, her tone brooking no argument. The whispers persisted, growing more intense as the night deepened. At one point, Liam swore he saw shadows flitting between the trees. When Emily peeked out the RV window, her heart stopped. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the glass. "Mark," she hissed. He joined her at the window, his face draining of color. The handprints weren't there earlier. A loud bang reverberated through the RV, followed by another. The walls shuddered as if something heavy was striking them. Sophie screamed, and Liam clung to his mother. "Everyone, stay together," Mark ordered, grabbing a flashlight. He moved toward the door but stopped short, remembering the journal's warning. "Whatever you do, don't open the door tonight," he whispered to himself. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, the family dared to hope it was over. Then came the laughter again, closer this time. Emily gasped as she saw small, childlike footprints appearing in the dirt outside, illuminated by the faint glow of their dying campfire. "What do they want?" Sophie whimpered. "I don't know," Emily said, pulling her children close. The laughter gave way to sobbing. It sounded like a child, alone and afraid. Against his better judgment, Mark opened the curtain a crack and shone his flashlight into the forest. The beam landed on a little girl standing just at the edge of the trees. She wore a tattered dress, her hair tangled and dirty. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Mark's racing heart. Mark stumbled back, pulling the curtain shut. "What did you see?" Emily demanded. "A little girl," he stammered. She said, "Help us." "It's a trick," Emily said firmly. "Whatever this is, it's not real." The family huddled together, enduring the longest night of their lives. The laughter, whispers, and banging continued intermittently, but they refused to open the door. As dawn broke, the noises ceased. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest waking up. When they finally stepped outside, the campsite was untouched, save for the footprints that led back into the woods. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, their resolve unspoken but mutual. "We're leaving," Mark said. As they packed up, Liam pointed toward the abandoned RV. It was gone. The family drove away, the forest shrinking in their rearview mirror. But the memory of that night lingered, etched into their minds. Weeks later, Emily searched online for any information about the family from the photos. She found a single article: "Family of 4 disappears in Pinewood Forest. RV found abandoned. No signs of struggle." Below the headline was the same photo they had seen in the abandoned RV. Emily's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. She never spoke of it to her family, but sometimes, late at night, she thought she could still hear the whispers. Story 4. The Woods That Moved. The forest clearing was everything Lauren and David had hoped for: serene, picturesque, and utterly secluded. Their RV rested comfortably in the center of a natural meadow, surrounded by towering pines and a horizon painted with the soft hues of an evening sunset. The couple had been looking forward to this escape for months, a weekend away from the relentless buzz of the city. "It's perfect," Lauren said, her voice almost a whisper as she stepped out of the RV to take in the view. David followed, carrying 2 folding chairs and a small cooler. No noisy neighbors, no traffic, no deadlines. Just us and nature. He set up the chairs and opened the cooler to retrieve 2 cold beers. Here's to peace and quiet. They clinked their bottles together, the faint sound of metal on glass carrying through the still air. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept across the clearing, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The first sign that something was off came that night. Lauren woke abruptly, her chest tight with an unshakable sense of unease. The RV was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. "David," she whispered, nudging him awake. "What is it?" he murmured groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Listen." They both held their breath, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, came a rustling sound. Not the rhythmic sway of leaves in the wind, but something deliberate, something moving. David frowned and sat up. "Probably an animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'll check it out." Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the same tall pines and the stillness of the clearing. David lingered for a moment, listening, before shaking his head and heading back inside. "Nothing out there," he said, closing the door behind him. "Go back to sleep." The next morning, Lauren was the first to notice it. The trees, they were closer. "David," she said, standing just outside the RV with her arms crossed. "Do you remember that big pine over there?" She pointed to a massive tree with gnarled roots. David stepped out and followed her gaze. "Yeah, what about it?" "It was further away yesterday, wasn't it? By at least 20 feet? David squinted, trying to recall the layout of the clearing from the day before. "Maybe. Trees all look the same after a while. You're probably imagining things." Lauren didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was different, closer. She spent the day trying to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But by evening, the unease returned. That night, the rustling came again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Lauren and David sat together on the edge of the bed, clutching each other as the sound grew closer, encircling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. "We're leaving in the morning," David said firmly. "Whatever this is, I'm not sticking around to find out." But when morning came, they discovered a new problem. The RV's tires were partially sunken into the ground. The once firm earth beneath them had turned into a thick, spongy muck. "What the hell?" David muttered, crouching to inspect the tires. "This wasn't here yesterday." Lauren stood nearby, her eyes scanning the forest. The trees were undeniably closer now, their towering trunks casting long, ominous shadows over the clearing. "It's like the ground is pulling us in," she said, her voice trembling. David grabbed a shovel from the RV's storage compartment and began digging around the tires. But the more he worked, the more the earth seemed to resist him. The muck oozed back into place, as if alive. By late afternoon, the RV had sunk even deeper. Panic began to set in. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees now only a few feet from the edges of the clearing. Their towering forms loomed over the RV, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Lauren's breathing quickened. "David, we have to go. Now." "And leave the RV?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration and fear. "How?" "On foot." "Yes," she snapped. "If we stay here, we're not going to make it." David hesitated, but the fear in Lauren's eyes convinced him. He grabbed their backpacks and stuffed them with essentials: water, food, a map, and a flashlight. As they prepared to leave, a low groaning sound echoed through the clearing. It was deep and resonant, like the earth itself was moaning. "Go!" Lauren screamed, pulling David toward the tree line. The couple ran, the dense forest closing in around them. The path ahead seemed to shift and twist, leading them in circles. Branches clawed at their clothes and skin, as if trying to hold them back. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into another clearing. To their horror, it was the same one they had just fled. The RV sat in the center, now half submerged in the ground. The trees around it were impossibly close, their trunks pressing against the metal shell. "This can't be happening," Lauren whispered, tears streaming down her face. David looked around, his jaw clenched. "We'll try again. There has to be a way out." They tried again and again, but every path led them back to the same clearing, the RV sinking further each time. By nightfall, the RV was almost completely swallowed by the earth. The forest was alive now, its movements undeniable. Trees creaked and groaned as they shifted positions, their branches reaching out like claws. Lauren and David huddled together near the dying campfire, too exhausted and terrified to move. The rustling sound returned, louder than ever, accompanied by whispers that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them. "It wants us," Lauren said, her voice barely audible. "The forest, it wants us." David shook his head, refusing to accept it. But deep down, he knew she was right. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, the forest was silent again. The RV was gone, completely swallowed by the earth. Lauren and David stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces pale and hollow. They didn't speak as they walked away, this time finding their way out of the forest with ease. But the memory of that night stayed with them, a lingering reminder of a force they couldn't explain. Back in the city, they sold their remaining camping gear and never spoke of the trip again. But sometimes, late at night, Lauren would dream of the forest. In her dreams, the trees were always moving. Story 5. The Creepy Hitchhiker. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ben tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing at the road ahead. He'd been driving his RV for hours, the solitude of the open road both a comfort and a gnawing reminder of how alone he was on this cross-country trip. He was somewhere deep in the Pacific Northwest, where the highways were bordered by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The next town was miles away, but Ben wasn't worried. His RV was well stocked, and he was looking forward to finding a secluded spot to park for the night. As he rounded a curve, His headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, clad in a worn jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, held out a thumb, signaling for a ride. Ben hesitated. He'd always been cautious about picking up strangers, but something about the man's posture, defeated and hunched, made him reconsider. With a sigh, Ben pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" The man nodded, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "If it's not too much trouble," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Ben unlocked the door, and the man climbed in, carrying a small, battered duffel bag. He took a seat on the passenger side, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thanks," the man said. "Not a lot of people stop for hitchhikers anymore." "Yeah, well, it's a lonely stretch of road," Ben replied, glancing at the man. He had a rugged face, lined with years of wear, and his eyes seemed distant, as if looking at something far away. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," the man said. "Anywhere with a roof will do." Ben nodded, focusing on the road. "I'm Ben, by the way. Call me Ray," the man said. For the first half hour, the ride was quiet. Ray stared out the window, his hands resting on his knees. Ben tried to make small talk, asking about where Ray was coming from and what he did for a living, but the man's answers were vague. "Been moving around a lot," Ray said. "The woods have a way of keeping you humble." Ben chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess so." It wasn't until the second hour that the conversation took an unsettling turn. Ray leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on Ben. "How far would you go to survive in the woods?" he asked suddenly. Ben blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "Say you got lost," Ray continued, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made Ben uneasy. "No food, no water, just you and the trees. How far would you go?" Ben laughed awkwardly. "I don't know. I guess I'd try to find help. Maybe hunt or forage." Ray tilted his head. "Hunt what? Animals? People?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. Ben glanced at Ray, hoping to see a smirk or some sign that he was joking, but Ray's expression remained unreadable. "People," Ben repeated, forcing a laugh. "That's a little extreme, don't you think?" Ray didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the window, his fingers drumming lightly on his duffel bag. As night fell, the road grew darker, the forest on either side an impenetrable wall of black. Ben's nerves were starting to fray. Ray's strange question had put him on edge, and the man's silence since then only made it worse. "I think there's a rest area up ahead," Ben said, breaking the tension. "We can stop for the night." Ray didn't respond, but Ben thought he saw the corner of the man's mouth twitch into a faint smile. The rest area was a small clearing off the highway, with a few picnic tables and a dilapidated restroom. Ben parked the RV and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "You can crash here if you want," Ben offered, gesturing to the RV's couch. "Better than sleeping outside." Ray nodded slowly. "Appreciate it." Ben grabbed some snacks from the kitchenette and handed one to Ray. The man accepted it without a word, peeling the wrapper back methodically. Ben watched him eat, his unease growing. There was something off about Ray, something he couldn't put his finger on. "You're not running from something, are you?" Ben asked, trying to sound casual. Ray paused mid-bite, then slowly looked up. "Aren't we all?" Ben forced a smile and stood up. "I'm gonna turn in. Long day of driving tomorrow." Ray didn't reply, his attention back on his snack. Ben lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way Ray spoke, the way he moved, it all felt deliberate, calculated. He decided to keep his keys close, just in case. Around midnight, Ben was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, like the creak of a floorboard. Then it came again, louder this time. Someone was moving around inside the RV. Heart pounding, Ben sat up and reached for his phone. The glow of the screen revealed Ray standing at the foot of the bed, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. "Ray, what are you doing?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Ray tilted his head. "You ever feel like you're being hunted, Ben?" Ben's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Ray stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Out here, in the woods, it's all about survival. Sometimes you're the hunter. Sometimes you're the prey." Ben scrambled out of bed, his back pressed against the wall. "Get out of my RV," he shouted. Ray didn't move. Instead, he reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. "You're strong, Ben," Ray said, his voice eerily calm. "I can see it. You do well out there. But first, you've got to prove yourself." Ben didn't wait to hear more. He lunged for the keys on the counter and bolted past Ray, shoving him aside. The man stumbled but didn't fall. Ben threw open the door and sprinted outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He could hear Ray behind him, his boots crunching on the gravel. Ben didn't look back. He ran into the woods, branches whipping at his face and arms. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a drum. The chase seemed to last forever. Ben didn't know how far he'd run or where he was. All he knew was that Ray was close, his footsteps echoing through the trees. Finally, Ben spotted a faint light in the distance. He ran toward it, his legs screaming in protest. The light grew brighter until he burst into another clearing, a ranger station. He banged on the door, shouting for help. A park ranger opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of Ben. "What happened?" Story 6. The Never-Ending Trail. The sun was warm and golden, casting dappled light through the tall pines as Megan and Liam stepped onto the marked trail. They had parked their RV in a small, secluded camping area nestled deep in a national forest, eager for a weekend of relaxation and exploration. Their golden retriever, Max, watched them from the RV's window, tail wagging. "We'll be back soon, boy," Megan called, smiling. She turned to Liam. "Let's make this quick. Max will lose his mind if we're gone too long." Liam adjusted the straps on his day pack, nodding. The sign said it's only a 2-mile loop, an hour tops. The trail was inviting, with soft earth underfoot and a gentle breeze rustling the trees. Megan snapped photos of the scenery while Liam occasionally stopped to inspect interesting plants or trees. They laughed, held hands, and talked about their plans for the weekend, a perfect escape from their hectic lives in the city. But as they walked, Megan began to notice something odd. "Didn't we pass that fallen log already?" she asked, pointing to a moss-covered trunk lying across the trail. Liam shook his head. "I don't think so. A lot of logs look the same out here." Megan frowned, but didn't argue. They continued walking, the forest growing denser. The cheerful bird song that had accompanied them earlier was now replaced by an eerie silence. After what felt like far more than 2 miles, Megan checked her watch. "We've been walking for almost an hour and a half. Shouldn't we be back by now?" Liam pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but the screen was blank. He frowned and shook it. No signal. Figures. Megan sighed. "Let's just retrace our steps." They turned around and headed back the way they came. But after another half hour, they ended up in the same spot. The fallen log, its mossy surface almost glowing in the dimming light. "What the hell?" Megan muttered, her voice tight with frustration. "We've been here already. I'm sure of it." Liam's jaw tightened. "Okay, let's stay calm. Maybe there's a shortcut we missed. Let's keep going." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Megan's unease grew with every step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their towering forms blotting out what little light remained. She clutched Liam's arm tightly. "Something's not right," she whispered. "It's like we're walking in circles." Liam nodded, his usual calm demeanor starting to crack. "I don't understand it. The trail's marked. We should..." A low growl cut him off. They froze, their breath catching. The sound came from somewhere ahead, deep and guttural. Liam instinctively stepped in front of Megan, his eyes scanning the dense underbrush. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping underfoot. "We need to move," Megan hissed, pulling at his arm. They turned and hurried back the way they came, but the trail seemed different now. The markers they'd been following were gone, replaced by thick, unbroken forest. Panic clawed at Megan's chest. "Where are we?" she cried. Liam's voice was grim. "I don't know." Night fell quickly, enveloping the forest in darkness. The couple used a flashlight from Liam's pack to light their way, but the beam seemed feeble against the oppressive blackness. Strange sounds surrounded them, rustling leaves, snapping branches, and faint whispers carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. Liam nodded. "Stay close." They pressed on, desperate to find their way back to the RV. But no matter how far they walked, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself like a cruel joke. Exhausted and frightened, they stopped in a small clearing to catch their breath. "We're lost," Megan said, tears streaming down her face. "What if we never get out?" Liam wrapped his arms around her, his own fear threatening to overwhelm him. "We will. We just need to keep going." Hours later, just when they thought they couldn't go any farther, they saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Relief flooded Megan's chest as she recognized the familiar shape of their RV. "We're back," she cried, breaking into a run. But as they approached, their relief turned to confusion. The RV looked different. The windows were dark, and the vehicle seemed older, worn down by years of neglect. A chill ran down Megan's spine. "Liam, is that ours?" Liam hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "It looks like it, but something's off." They stepped closer, and that's when they saw it. The door to the RV was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Scratches marred the paint, and deep gouges lined the frame, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Megan clutched Liam's arm. "What happened here?" Liam shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to check it out." They climbed the steps cautiously, the RV's interior bathed in shadow. Inside, the space was eerily quiet. Max's bed was empty, his leash lying discarded on the floor. "Max?" Megan called, her voice breaking. A faint growl answered from the back of the RV. Megan and Liam froze. Slowly, the growl grew louder, more menacing. Liam grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound. What they saw made their blood run cold. In the corner of the RV, where Max's bed had been, sat a creature unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was hunched and skeletal, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Its mouth curled into a snarl, revealing jagged, blood-stained teeth. "Run," Liam whispered. Megan didn't need to be told twice. They bolted from the RV, the creature's growl rising into a deafening roar. They didn't stop running until the RV was far behind them, its dark silhouette swallowed by the forest. When dawn finally broke, they found themselves back at the trailhead, their car still parked where they'd left it. But the RV was gone. There was no sign of Max, no sign of the endless trail or the horrors they'd encountered. Megan and Liam never spoke of that night again, but every so often, they'd hear whispers in the wind or catch a glimpse of glowing eyes in the shadows. And they'd wonder if the forest was still watching, waiting for its next victims. Story 7. The Stalker in the Fog. Elliot was no stranger to solo road trips. For years, his RV had been both his escape and his sanctuary, taking him to places where the noise of the world couldn't reach. This time, he'd set his sights on a remote lakeside campground nestled deep in the mountains. No cell service, no people, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. He arrived in the late afternoon, the golden sunlight filtering through the pines. The campground was empty, as he'd hoped. He parked his RV near the water, the lake's glassy surface reflecting the towering evergreens that surrounded it. After setting up a small fire, he cooked a quick meal and settled into a folding chair with a book. The solitude was perfect. By the time Elliot retired to bed, the night had grown colder, and a faint mist had begun to creep in from the lake. He barely noticed it as he closed the curtains and climbed into his bed, the soft hum of the forest lulling him to sleep. But when he woke the next morning, the world outside his RV had transformed. A dense fog blanketed the campground, so thick he couldn't see the lake just a few yards away. The trees were mere shadows, their forms distorted and ghostly. Elliot frowned as he stepped outside, the air damp and heavy. That's when he noticed them, footprints in the soft earth, leading directly to his RV door. His stomach tightened. He crouched to examine them. They were large, likely from a man's boots, and fresh. Very fresh. But something was wrong. There were no footprints leading away. He glanced around, his heart pounding, but the fog concealed everything beyond a few feet. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the mist. No response. Shaking off the unease, Elliot convinced himself it was nothing. Perhaps he'd been too tired to notice the prints last night. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as he went about his day. He stayed close to the RV, his book abandoned, and his eyes constantly scanning the fog for movement. By evening, the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Elliot locked the RV door and double-checked the latches on the windows before sitting down to eat. As he stared at his plate, he couldn't ignore the oppressive silence outside. Even the usual sounds of nature were absent. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, suffocating stillness. He went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, he lay awake listening. The silence pressed against his ears until every creak of the RV felt deafening. Then came the tapping. It started softly, a faint tick-tick-tick against the window by the kitchen. Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the random sound of branches brushing against the RV. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. He slid out of bed silently, grabbing the heavy flashlight he kept by the door. His heart pounded as he moved toward the sound. The curtains were drawn over the window, and for a moment, he hesitated. What if someone was out there? What if they weren't alone? With a deep breath, he yanked the curtain aside and shone the flashlight outside. Nothing, just the fog, thick and impenetrable, swirling lazily beyond the glass. He let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. Then came the tapping again, but this time it was on the window behind him. Elliot spun around, the flashlight's beam shaking. He didn't bother with the curtain this time. Instead, he moved to the center of the RV, gripping the flashlight tightly. His mind raced. Was it an animal? No, the taps were too precise. A prankster? But he hadn't seen or heard another soul since he arrived. He waited, every muscle in his body tense. Minutes passed. The tapping stopped. Exhausted and on edge, he crawled back into bed, the flashlight still in his hand. He didn't sleep well, his dreams plagued by shadows moving in the fog. The next morning, Elliot woke to find the fog still there, as unyielding as ever. And now, there were more footprints. They circled the RV, overlapping and chaotic, as though someone had paced around it all night. His stomach churned as he followed their path. Once again, there were no tracks leading away. He decided it was time to leave. Whatever peace he'd hoped to find here had vanished. He packed quickly, barely eating, and climbed into the driver's seat. But when he turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. No, 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 he muttered, trying again. The engine refused to start. He checked the fuel gauge full. He'd had the RV serviced before the trip. There was no reason for it to fail now. Panic set in. He stepped outside to check the engine, but the moment his feet hit the ground, the fog seemed to close in tighter, muffling his movements. He opened the hood, his hands shaking as he inspected the engine. Everything looked fine. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the fog. Elliot froze, his breath hitching. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped. He turned in circles, flashlight in hand, but the fog revealed nothing. Heart pounding, he climbed back into the RV and locked the door. That night, the tapping returned. It came from every window, one after the other. As if something was circling the RV, Elliot sat in the driver's seat, gripping a kitchen knife, his eyes darting between the windows. The fog outside seemed alive, pressing against the glass, shifting and swirling in unnatural patterns. Then, through the windshield, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the fog's edge, tall and motionless, its face obscured. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step closer. In another. It stopped just outside the windshield, its form barely visible through the fog. Elliot couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure raised a hand and placed it against the glass, leaving behind a smeared handprint. Then it leaned forward, and though its face was still hidden, Elliot felt its gaze pierce through him. "Leave," it whispered, the word barely audible but cutting through the silence like a blade. When Elliot woke the next morning, the fog had lifted. The footprints were gone. The RV's engine started without issue, and the lake glimmered under the morning sun as if nothing had happened. But Elliot didn't stay to admire the view. He drove away, the tires kicking up dust as he left the campground behind. He never spoke of the trip to anyone, but sometimes, on quiet nights, he'd hear faint tapping on the windows of his apartment, and he'd wonder if the fog had followed him home. Story 8. The Vanishing Campground. The group of friends had been driving for hours, their RV rumbling along the winding mountain roads. Chloe, the planner of the trip, was staring at the map app on her phone. "There's supposed to be a campground nearby," she said, frowning, "but I'm not seeing any signs for it. Maybe it's one of those places that's not on Google Maps," suggested Max, her boyfriend, leaning over her shoulder. "That's super reassuring," muttered Emma, their friend, from the back of the RV. "Are we sure this trip wasn't a mistake?" "Relax," said Jake, Emma's brother, who was driving. "We'll find something. Worst case, we park and camp in the woods." As if on cue, a wooden sign appeared at the side of the road. "Whispering Pines Campground, 2 miles ahead." "See?" Jake said, grinning. "Told you." Chloe frowned. "That's weird. I've checked 3 different apps, and none of them show this place. Maybe it's new," Max offered. "Or just private," Jake added. "Let's check it out." The campground was nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The entrance was marked by an ornate archway carved with intricate patterns of leaves and animals. It looked almost too perfect, like something out of a painting. "This place is beautiful," Emma admitted as they pulled into a spot near the center of the campground. Other RVs and tents were scattered around, but the place wasn't crowded. A few campers waved politely as they passed. A man in a park ranger's uniform approached them as they stepped out of the RV. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a warm, almost too perfect smile. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," he said. "I'm Ranger Bennett. Let me know if you need anything during your stay." "Thanks," Jake said. "Do we need to register or pay a fee?" Bennett shook his head. "No need. We're just happy to have visitors. Enjoy your stay." As he walked away, Chloe glanced at the others. "That was odd, right? Maybe they're just really friendly here," Max said. The first night was peaceful. The friends cooked dinner over a fire pit, shared stories, and marveled at the clarity of the night sky. The stars seemed closer than usual, twinkling like diamonds against the inky black. It wasn't until the next day that things started to feel off. Emma noticed it first. As she went for a morning walk, she realized that the other campers didn't seem to be doing much. Most of them sat outside their RVs or tents, staring into the forest or at the ground. A few smiled at her, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. "Hey, did anyone else notice how weird everyone is here?" she asked when she returned to their campsite. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It's like they're waiting for something," Emma said. "I don't know. It's creepy." "You're overthinking it," Max said. "They're just here to relax, like us." But as the day went on, they all began to notice the odd behavior. Campers sat motionless for hours. One woman stood at the edge of the lake, her reflection shimmering in the water, but she didn't move. Another man walked in slow, deliberate circles around his tent. "Okay, this is officially weird," Chloe said that evening. "Let's leave tomorrow." The next morning, they packed up quickly and climbed into the RV. Jake started the engine, and they pulled onto the road that led to the campground's exit. But after driving for 10 minutes, they realized something was wrong. "This doesn't look right," Chloe said, staring out the window. "We should have hit the main road by now." Jake slowed the RV. The road ahead twisted and turned, but it seemed to lead deeper into the forest instead of out of it. "Maybe we missed a turn," Max suggested. Jake reversed, but after driving back the way they'd come, they found themselves back at the campground entrance. The ornate archway loomed before them. "What the hell?" Emma whispered. Jake gritted his teeth and tried again. This time, they drove straight for nearly an hour, but the result was the same. No matter which direction they took, the road always looped back to Whispering Pines. By the time the sun set, panic had set in. The friends sat in the RV, the curtains drawn, their voices hushed. "We're trapped," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "How is this even possible?" "I don't know," Jake said, "but we're not staying here another night." As they debated their next move, a knock came at the RV door. Everyone froze. The knock came again, louder this time. "Don't answer it," Emma whispered. "Maybe it's Bennett," Max said. "Maybe he can help us." But when Jake peeked through the curtain, it wasn't Bennett. It was one of the other campers, a man with a vacant expression and a strange, unnatural grin. He stood perfectly still, staring at the door. "What do you want?" Jake called out. The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed toward the lake. "Nope," Emma said, backing away. "We're not going out there." The man knocked again, harder this time. Then, as if on cue, more campers emerged from the foggy darkness. They surrounded the RV, their faces blank, their movements eerily synchronized. Some of them carried lanterns, their flickering light casting long, distorted shadows. "They're trying to keep us here," Chloe whispered. "We need to go. Now." Jake started the engine, and the RV roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the vehicle surged forward, scattering the campers in its path. The road twisted and turned, the headlights cutting through the dense fog. For a moment, it seemed like they might finally escape. But then the RV skidded to a halt. The road ahead had vanished, replaced by a wall of trees that hadn't been there a moment before. The group spent the rest of the night trying to find a way out, but every attempt ended the same way, with them back at the campground. Exhausted and terrified, they eventually collapsed inside the RV, waiting for morning. When the sun rose, the campground was empty. The other campers were gone, and the place was eerily silent. Desperate, they tried the road one last time. This time, it led them back to the main highway, as if nothing had happened. As they drove away, no one spoke. Chloe glanced back once, but the campground was gone, replaced by an unbroken stretch of forest. Whispering pines had vanished, leaving them with only the memory of its impossible roads and the unsettling feeling that they'd been allowed to leave. But why? Story 9, The Forest Guardian. The RV rattled noisily as it climbed the winding dirt road deeper into the forest. The trees here were taller, their thick canopies blotting out most of the sunlight. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dense greenery. "Are you sure we're allowed to camp here?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "The map says this area isn't restricted," replied Mark, her boyfriend, gripping the steering wheel. "Besides, it's miles away from any tourist spots. Isn't that the whole point?" In the back, their friends, Rachel and Eric, were lounging on the couch, oblivious to Sarah's unease. They'd spent most of the drive joking and taking photos, treating this trip like an adventure. "Look at this place," Rachel said, gesturing out the window. "It's like we're in another world." The RV rounded a bend, and suddenly the forest opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a large stone marker covered in moss and carvings. The carvings were intricate, depicting animals, trees, and symbols none of them recognized. "Perfect spot," Mark announced, pulling the RV to a stop. "Let's set up here." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group gathered around a campfire. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. The stone marker loomed nearby, its carvings almost glowing in the flickering firelight. "So, what do you think these symbols mean?" Eric asked, pointing his flashlight at the marker. "Maybe it's some kind of ancient language," Sarah suggested. "We're probably on sacred ground." "Sacred ground?" Rachel laughed. "What, like a burial site or something?" Sarah didn't respond. She had a nagging feeling that they shouldn't be here, but she didn't want to spoil the mood. Instead, she stared into the fire, trying to shake the unease. As the night deepened, an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. The group didn't notice at first, too engrossed in their conversations and laughter. But then the RV shook. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. Mark stood up, glancing toward the vehicle. "Probably just the wind." "There is no wind," Eric said, his tone uneasy. Another violent shake rocked the RV, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from every direction. The friends froze, their eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. "We're not alone," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. They decided to retreat into the RV, locking the doors and closing the curtains. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stood near the window, his eyes scanning the clearing for any movement. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the growling continued, growing louder and closer. Then came the hallucinations. It started with Eric. He gasped, his eyes wide with terror as he stumbled backward. "It's here," he shouted. "It's coming for me." "What are you talking about?" Rachel asked, grabbing his arm. But Eric didn't respond. He was staring at something none of them could see. Suddenly, he screamed and bolted for the door. Mark managed to grab him just in time, dragging him back inside. "Let me go," Eric yelled, struggling. "I have to get away." "There's nothing out there," Mark shouted. "Snap out of it." But Eric wasn't the only one. Rachel began to sob uncontrollably, clutching her head. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "They're watching us." Mark and Sarah exchanged terrified glances. Whatever was happening, it was targeting them one by one. Sarah tried to keep calm, but she could feel the hallucinations creeping in. She heard whispers, faint at first but growing louder. They seemed to come from inside her own mind, urging her to leave the RV and enter the forest. "Do you hear that?" she asked Mark. "Hear what?" he replied, his voice shaking. "The whispers," Sarah said. "They're calling me." Mark grabbed her shoulders. "Stay with me, Sarah. Whatever this is, we can fight it." But the RV shook again, harder this time, as if something massive was trying to tip it over. The growling returned, deeper and more menacing, accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. "What does it want?" Rachel cried, her voice raw with fear. "It's the marker," Sarah said suddenly. "We disturbed its ground." Mark nodded, his face pale. Then we put it right. Come on. Steeling themselves, the group grabbed flashlights and stepped outside. The growling seemed to surround them, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. They approached the stone marker, its carvings now glowing faintly in the darkness. "What do we do?" Rachel asked, clutching Sarah's arm. "We need to show respect," Sarah said. She knelt before the marker, her hands trembling. "We're sorry," she said aloud. "We didn't mean to trespass." The others followed her lead, bowing their heads. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the growling stopped. The oppressive energy lifted, and the forest seemed to exhale, as if releasing a long-held breath. The group hurried back to the RV and drove away without looking back. As they left the clearing, the stone marker seemed to fade into the shadows, its glowing carvings dimming until they disappeared entirely. No one spoke for the rest of the drive. The hallucinations had stopped, but the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the power of the forest and the unseen forces that protected it. Whatever the forest guardian was, they knew one thing for certain. It did not take kindly to intruders. Story 10. The Lights in the Sky. It was a crisp autumn evening when the Thompson family decided to venture into the mountains for a weekend getaway. Bill and Sarah, along with their 2 teenage children, Alex and Emma, had been planning the trip for months. They packed their RV with food, blankets, and every essential for a peaceful weekend of stargazing, hiking, and unwinding from the pressures of city life. The remote campsite they had chosen was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the hustle and bustle, offering a perfect view of the clear, starlit sky. As the family set up their camp, the excitement was palpable. They lit a small campfire and roasted marshmallows, the smell of charred sugar mingling with the earthy scent of pine and moss. Emma, with her camera in hand, was already taking pictures of the starry sky above, while Alex fiddled with his telescope. Bill and Sarah relaxed in camping chairs, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the serene surroundings. The night sky was an enchanting canvas of constellations. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. The tranquility was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Bill checked his watch. It was nearing midnight, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The family decided to head inside the RV to get some sleep, but not before one last glance at the stars. "Look at that," Alex said, pointing toward the sky. At first, Sarah thought it was just another star or satellite, but as she focused, she saw something unusual, strange, pulsing lights in the distance. They were hovering just above the treetops, bright yet gentle, their colors shifting from a soft white to a pale blue, and then to a deep red. The lights moved in a peculiar way, not like any aircraft they had seen before. They swirled in a slow, mesmerizing dance, almost as if they were aware of being watched. "That's odd," Bill muttered, standing up to get a better look. "Is that a drone or something?" "No way," Emma replied, her eyes wide with curiosity. That something else? The lights hovered silently, their rhythmic pulses seeming to synchronize with the beating of the family's hearts. It was as if time had slowed and nothing in the world mattered except the strange display above them. The whole family stood, entranced by the lights. For what felt like hours, they gazed up at the sky, unable to look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light show stopped. The pulsing lights blinked out, leaving the family standing in eerie silence. "Did that just," Sarah began, but her words trailed off. There was a strange disorientation in the air. The temperature had dropped further, and the night felt unnervingly still. Bill checked his watch once more. It was now 7 a.m. "What? How is it morning already?" Alex whispered, his voice filled with confusion. The entire family stood frozen, trying to comprehend the situation. They had been outside for hours, yet it felt like only minutes had passed since they had seen the lights. It was as if an entire night had been erased, stolen from them in a blink of an eye. Sarah shook her head, attempting to gather her thoughts. "We must have fallen asleep outside," she suggested, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "But I don't remember doing that." The family quickly gathered inside the RV, the sense of unease growing. As they began to talk through what had happened, they realized that none of them could remember falling asleep or even entering the RV. The last clear memory they shared was of standing outside, watching the lights in the sky. Yet now, the sun was rising, and the air felt thick with unspoken questions. "Maybe we just lost track of time," Bill said, trying to rationalize it. But even he wasn't convinced. The confusion deepened when they noticed something else. Strange, red marks on their arms. They were faint but unmistakable, like circular impressions, as though something had pressed against their skin with a strange force. Each family member had them in similar patterns, but none could recall how they had gotten there. "These look like burns," Emma said, inspecting the marks on her arm. Alex leaned closer to examine his own. "What the hell happened to us?" Bill ran his fingers through his hair, frustration mounting. "It must be some kind of bug or irritation, maybe from the air, or something we touched in the woods. Let's just pack up and head back to town." But as the family packed up the RV, the lingering sense of unease wouldn't leave. The marks on their arms were not the only strange thing. The woods around them felt different, darker, as if the trees had shifted overnight. The sounds of nature were muffled, distant, and the air was thick with a subtle tension. As they drove away from the campsite, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following them, but the road behind was empty. The woods faded away as they reached the highway, but still, the discomfort lingered. The entire family was on edge, unable to fully process the surreal experience. Bill tried to convince himself that it was just an odd, but ultimately explainable occurrence. Perhaps the lights were some sort of military test, or a natural phenomenon they hadn't heard of before. Yet the sense of something otherworldly, something beyond their comprehension, gnawed at him. Back at home, the confusion only deepened. The marks on their arms didn't fade. They remained, faint but stubborn, as though etched into their skin by an invisible hand. Alex and Emma, who had been particularly shaken by the events, began to have unsettling dreams. In these dreams, they were once again standing in the woods, staring up at the pulsing lights. But this time, they were not alone. Figures stood just beyond the trees, watching them with dark, hollow eyes. Weeks passed, but the feeling of being watched never truly left. Bill found himself checking over his shoulder more often, and Sarah became obsessed with the marks on her arm. She researched everything from strange alien encounters to sleep paralysis, but nothing quite matched their experience. The kids stopped talking about it, but the unease was still there, bubbling beneath the surface. One day, a strange letter arrived at their doorstep. It was a plain, unmarked envelope, and inside was a single, typed line. "You were not meant to remember." The family stared at it, their minds racing. What did it mean? Who had sent it? In the weeks that followed, the Thompsons would come to realize that their encounter with the lights in the sky had not been an isolated event. There were others who had experienced similar phenomena. Others who, like them, couldn't quite remember what had happened, but knew deep down that something had changed. Something had been altered. And as the family continued to grapple with the strange events of that night, they couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that the lights were not a random occurrence, but a warning. A warning that, perhaps, they were not alone in the world, and that the secrets of the universe were far darker and more dangerous than they could ever have imagined.